Good morning, everyone, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Reshma Krishnan Barshikar to all of you. And she is a travel writer and a novelist, and she has published two books, Fade into Red and Hidden Children, The Lost Grimoire. And she contributes to The Hindu, and she has also contributed a lot of works to National Geographic Traveler and a lot of other publications. And once again, I welcome you to the session, ma'am. So, shall we begin the session by hearing from you about both of your books?
I think my first book was an adult novel, Fade into Red. So it was about, I think it somewhat mirrored what I was going through at the time, which was a sense of what they call a quarter life crisis, or a quarter life crisis, or a 30-year-old life crisis, which is what am I doing? Am I happy? Because I had worked very hard to get to a point in my life where I was successful, I was making money, and I was doing what I wanted to do since I was 14, 15 years old. Which was be an investment banker. But at the age of around 32, 33, I think 34, the years went by. I think, worked too hard and got a little burnt out. And so woke up, and it wasn't a waking up one day. It was just a gradual indifference towards what I was doing. And so I decided to try my hand at something I'd always done in my life, written really bad poetry, but written a lot of travel articles, just small things. I started sending them out to people. People liked them. And then I went on vacation and I started to tell a story. And I've always been a storyteller, even as a child. So in my mind, the best times are telling stories to my friends. Like, we'd sit in a graveyard in Ooty, and my job was essentially to entertain all my friends and tell a story. So the headless girl, or how Evil Dead was really big growing up. So I think, and I think over time I realized that perhaps I should try my hand at it, and it came very naturally to me. So the first book came out, and I was lucky enough to get it published by a very reputable publisher for a first-time novelist, Penguin Random House. After that, though, even though that was an adult novel, a coming-of-age novel as such, I realized that my heart was always with fantasy, supernatural, like ghosts, graveyards, magic. And so and that's what I read as well. I read fantasy. I read, supernatural literature. I read high fantasy, J.R.R. Martin, Robin Hobb, Rebecca Hartman. And so I said I wanted to write a story about, and also at the time, I was witnessing a lot. I think Instagram really came to life about 3 years ago. And I used to do these creative writing classes, and I'd see youngsters like 15, 16, wanting to be like other girls all the time, they're always checking themselves, always finding the right light, the right filter. And I realized there was a tremendous pressure on young people today to be extraordinary all the time, which we didn't face as young children at all. We could look what we like. We didn't have to wax our hands. We didn't have to worry about what other people thought of us. I mean, only thing we had to worry about if you were in a small town, I'm from Coimbatore, is what maybe your parents' friends thought of you. And I didn't even care about that. Like, I literally didn't care at all. Today, you're worried about what 200, 300, 400 people think of you who you've never even met. And that started to play on my mind, and I wanted to explore that through young adult literature, which was essentially how far does a young mind go, to what price will a young mind pay to be extraordinary. And that was the kind of question I wanted to ask, and try to find that journey through fantasy and stuff that I like and stories I like to tell.
Okay. So I've heard the kind of books that you read influence the way you write. So now I would like you to take a step back and tell us the kind of books that you read when you were probably our age.
So what is everyone's age here? So how old is everyone here? Sorry? 18. So I can guess not 18. So when I was, I went through an intense period of reading at university, and before that at my A level. So the books, my writing's very lyrical, so it's primarily influenced by poets. Like poets have pretty much influenced my writing. So everyone from John Donne to Seamus Heaney, to Ramanujam, obviously, and Carol Ann Duffy. So poets have made a massive difference to my life. But books from a specific, primarily young adult fantasy and crime literature. So I'm obviously the odd Wuthering. Yes, I love Wuthering Heights. I'm not a big Jane Austen fan. But I love the Bronte sisters. I live for the Bronte sisters. I think they're very dark and very indulgent, which is what I like writing to be. I like writing to be indulgent, dark. I love Shirley Jackson. Everybody must read, everyone must read Shirley Jackson, Haunting on Hill House. We once lived in a palace, I think. We all lived in a castle. You have to read these books if you're into this genre. Susan Hill. So my kind of it's not necessarily George R.R. Martin. I started reading him when I was 18 years old, right? Obviously Rowling, yeah, and P.D. James, yeah.
So,
Hilary Mantel.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
And when you write the excerpts, whatever I've read from your books, it's so visual. So it's like when you read the Bronte sisters, you get to know about the Moors of Northumbria.
Yeah.
So it's like that. So could you tell us how you've tried to describe surroundings and how visual your works are? What about that?
So I think that's essentially young adult fiction. What the best young adult fiction, especially fantasy fiction, Tolkien. I mean, how could I forget Tolkien? Is that for young adults and for adults mostly, but for young adults, you're trying to make their imagination work. I'm a very cinematic writer, so I can spend 2 pages describing this tree. My issue is actually to pull it back and not bore you to death, which I can do. So that's what I do in my draft when I redraft my work. I think because I'm a cinematic writer, I like to show you whatever I see in my head, and I'm a huge Stephen King fan as well. So I think it's essentially your imagination has to work, but you need to give children, especially fantasy, if you don't describe fantasy, for instance, if I tell you that there's a snake in that tree and it loves to talk to the other snake in the tree, you are not going to be able to suspend your disbelief. It takes time for me to make you suspend your disbelief. I have to get you to start imagining your surroundings and really pull you in before you can believe that a snake can talk to another snake.
Okay.
Because as a child, you will believe that. So as toddlers or 3 or 4-year-olds, you are willing to believe that rabbits and hares and Mickeys and Minnies can talk. But as young adults, you get, you're getting cynical and you understand that magic doesn't exist. But if you want to bring that but magic is the best vehicle for young adults and for anybody, in fact, as a metaphor to understand themselves better, to understand the darkness or the lightness of life. So I find it a wonderful vehicle and I love it. So for me, but to bring someone in, you have to give them that level of detail. Otherwise, it's like watching a Shah Rukh Khan film. Or, there's no detail. So yeah, how are you surviving 7 spears to your body? Where does that kind of superhuman effort come from? So description is critical.
Okay. And I guess you travel a lot. So how has travel influenced your writing? And you've also stayed in India and then you've been abroad. So do you think your style of writing has changed when you've traveled and lived in different places? The ideas, your perceptions, and how that is influenced. Do you also have we all have a lot of unrealistic dreams. So do you make it a reality in your fantasy?
One, I think so many questions there. So let me just take the first one. One, I think absolutely. I did my education in India till I was 14. And after that, I left to do my A-levels in England, followed by university, where I did international business. I think my 2 years of doing A-level English literature was critical to me, who I am as a writer today, because all the John Donne and the Seamus Heaney and the Paul Scott and whatever I read at the time has influenced my writing today, and it gave me an interest in reading, something other than a lot of the stuff that I was reading at the time. What travel? I don't travel as much. I have a 3-year-old, so I don't get to travel. This is the most. I only travel for festivals. But travel before then, travel was actually the way I began to write, because I think what happens when you travel, as a travel writer, description is very critical, and I love describing things. So what happened when I was traveling, I started describing places I was in. And so that then very automatically lent itself to being stories. Interestingly, in my travel stories, my editors always came back to me and said, it's beautiful, it's such a great story. So I realized that I can, constantly trying to tell a story. So even if it's real, I like to bring in not fictional elements, but, a story behind everything. I loved doing research. So when I went to, for instance, Tuscany for my first book, I spent a month in vineyards. I harvested wine, I met vintners, I did, and that comes actually from my investment banking background, because you have to do so much research. And I said, if you're going to write about a wine deal, you need to go know everything about wine. And that's not just drinking it, that's just going and finding out how it's made, meeting vintners, understanding terroir, so that again, your work is not superficial. I'm not trying to bore a reader, but I think that you need to, I love the research part of my work. Even for this book, I did a significant amount of work on researching it. So travel essentially pushed me into writing. So that's what I think, does, yeah.
And Terribly Tiny Tales versus novel. I would like to hear your comments on it.
Sorry?
Terribly Tiny Tales. Very small stories. That's what most people prefer to read today. And I would like to know, what do you think about them versus novels?
Okay, so here's the thing. I think the short story is the ultimate goal for a writer, and I can't do it. As in, I think perhaps every chapter is a short story, maybe, but the short story is the goal, I think, and that's why we study it. That's why you guys study it, right? I didn't study it because I didn't do it. I personally don't like reading them, because I like getting stuck into my stories, and I want to stay there for a long time, which is why I read very thick books like Lord of the Rings or George R.R. Martin or Hilary Mantel. I like thick, fat books where you get in and you don't get out for days. Yeah. So personally prefer getting sucked into literature, and I think that's not happening enough. So I don't think people are able to sit down and concentrate on a 500-word book, and that they need to do. Because I think what happens is then everything, when you're reading, your entire body is working towards creating an image in your mind. So everything is working. You think it's not working and you think it's sedentary, but yes, you're not being physical. Everything is in concentration. One goal is to get that picture in your mind. What happens is when you're on Twitter or anything else, you're constantly distracted because everything is so short. So I don't think short stories are terribly tiny tales. So I think short stories are just fantastic forms of ultimate writing. It's like the epitome of a good writer. But the whole 440 words or 240 words, they're not stories as such. I think they're just, I don't know. But I still think that if it makes people write, that it doesn't matter. If you're writing and you're reading and you're writing, it doesn't matter what you write or what you read.
Okay. So now, these days, books or novels in general have to compete with videos, computer games, and the social media to grab the attention of the reader. So how do you think you, as a writer, have tried to grasp the attention of the reader and to make the reader engrossed in the book?
Yeah, especially because I'm talking to young adults and people. So, one, I think that's the reason why fantasy is such a massive genre in young adult literature globally, is because it can still compete with social media, because social media doesn't have fantasy from that perspective, So if you want to read about fantastical things like dragons and people who speak to butterflies and people who can fly, that kind of stuff, you still need to go into the movies, or so I think our competition is the movies perhaps, but not necessarily. And we are telling stories. I think you have to have a very strong visual component to pull kids in. And I'm going to focus a lot on young adults here, so this side, and people who read young adult literature. You have to pull people in visually. So for instance, for this book, the cover, I spend a lot of time on the cover. In fact, my friends, adults even, by the way, have loved the book, talk about how the cover makes them feel like it's magical. So, and then beyond that, I think you have to make it relevant. I think a lot of what we're doing today is not relevant to people who want to, especially for youngsters. So make it relevant to them. Think about their influences. Weave those influences in, and then really touch a chord of what is at the heart of it. So many of the people who've read the book have come to tell me, I feel this way. I feel that I am ordinary. I feel that I want to be Deepika Padukone every day, but I can't be Deepika Padukone. So what do I do what is this magic potion that I will drink to make my life wonderful? And I think the book is trying to tell you to find the extraordinary in and that's what the girl does eventually. She, after all this, so essentially she's the story is about a girl learning how to speak about a butterfly, right? There's one other girl comes to her and says, do you want to learn to speak to a butterfly? And she says, yes, of course, but there's a price you pay to speak to a butterfly, right? And what is that price? So these two girls and form this intense friendship where the things they go through to learn to speak to a butterfly, how one teaches the other. And in the process of that, she forgets the rest of her ordinary life. And yet when she comes back to the ordinary life, she finds that that's what was extraordinary about it. And so that's what everyone came back to me and saying that, oh my God, yes, that's possible. And that's what we're all looking for. So not to try and be this perfect thing all the time.
And do you think young adult fiction is, it's just for young adults or children, or is it for everyone?
Oh, not at all. Young adult. So the genre young adult fantasy fiction is to tell people like me, I'm 40, right? Tell people like me that this is what the book is about. So, for instance, a lot of people, read Robin Hobb, Sarah J. Maas, Cassandra Clare, Veronica Roth, and we're all adults. Whereas we love young adult fantasy fiction. So young adult fantasy fiction is from anyone from the ages of 12. It's actually really from 13. But now people are reading slight earlier fictions, the Hunger Games. A lot of the people who read the Hunger Games were 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds. What the young adult fantasy fiction means is it is the journey of, they're usually coming of age novels, where they're using fantasy as a metaphor to address some of the first flushes of darkness and first flushes of excitement, of love, of power. 13, 14 is when most people in their lives express certain things. So it's a very powerful moment in time to capture. So that's what you're trying to distill and put it in a bottle, so that everyone can experience it. Everyone can experience first flushes of joy, love, lust, greed, adventure, terror, darkness. That's why adults love it as well, because it then is, that's it. It's not necessarily what it is it's written keeping in mind that young adults will read it. So language is, it doesn't mean the language is childlike, but language it doesn't have swear words. It's public library, it's school library, it's okay for school libraries. And if, for instance, a 10-year-old happens to pick it up, as long as they can handle the darkness, it's okay. So we're very careful, and I'm very, very careful about how much violence I put in my books. I think the Hunger Games, for instance, are too violent for a 12 or 13-year-old to read, personally. So you have to keep in mind that you want to tell a story, but you don't want to scare anybody too much.
Okay. And how do you structure your works? Like, even when you started writing, how did you start? Where did this idea come from, the first book and the second book? How did you get the idea, and how did you start working on it? Did you started from the beginning, or you started writing from the middle, and then you changed the whole thing, and then how did you work on your novel? The
I
idea.
think the Hidden Children came about because of a dream actually I had about this girl. I think I was flying with crows or some birds over broken villages, and it was a very vivid dream. So I woke up, and I tend to do that. I wake up and I write things. A lot of my stuff comes from dreams. Very, very influenced. Wake up, wrote it all down, and at the same time, of course, I was also very curious about social media. I was doing writing workshops, but I was also very curious about. So I was going to writing workshops and in Bombay and Delhi, and these urban Indian children, when they finished their story, they would read out the story, and their characters would be Rebecca, places would be Chicago. The characters would never be Indian. They would never have Indian names. They would never have Indian parents. They'd have yard sales and proms. And I was like, why? And I had to question that about myself as well, because I was like, because that's what I grew up on. I grew up on Enid Blyton. I grew up on R.L. Stein. So I found that all of these, and it's not that there's something wrong about that. It is perfectly fine to read Rowling and Percy Jackson and all of that. But I realized that these kids had nothing of their own that told them that their lives were cool, that their parents were cool, that their cities were cool, be it Trivandrum or be it Bombay. I realized that the young adults had nothing about Bombay. They had nothing that said that the gateway of India could be magical. There was nothing that said that fort could be magical, that our banyans are magical, and we have our own understanding of magic and fantasy that is outside mythology. And I realized it was because they were pretty tired of mythology, and that's all they thought, and therefore they were very happy to go and read other things. And so I said, why don't I write a fantasy? That's what I'll read. So it just kind of came to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so then, could you read an excerpt from your book that you'd like?
Read an excerpt from my book. I didn't prepare for this. Let me quickly find something. So just to give you a background of the novel, as I said, the novel is about a girl wanting to speak to a butterfly, but essentially it's also about this magical community that lives parallel to our everyday community called the Vitana, and they live in these large trees that essentially from the outside look like a tree, something like this, and then like massive tree houses. And so this, the community is, and what I'm trying to do, this girl is trying to both understand where magic comes from, as well as side by side, I'm also telling the story of another great magical being that came from Calcutta. So Calcutta was a massive influence for me, and Calcutta is every storyteller's dream because it's still so much in the past. Good and bad about that, but for a storyteller, it's amazing. So I think, there are two stories in parallel. One that goes back in time in 18th century Calcutta, and one about this girl Shui who lives in Bombay and has met a girl called Anya, who's from Scotland, half Scottish, half Indian, and who's trying to teach her magic. And so the excerpt I'm going to read is perhaps because we also have people who are hi. Abba, the Stormbringer. Abba had never had a kairos, and so knew no different way to live. The only child of a boatman, she spent most of her time traversing the Hooghly River in her father's Goloya, ferrying passengers to and from the Kidirpur docks, watching them like hawks, and returning change into a little black leather pouch. Like everyone else, her father had wished for a son, but his heart was Abba's as soon as she held his little finger. His wife disappeared soon after. So she was all he had, and he taught her everything he knew. Soon, however, he found she would know much more than he ever could. By the time she was 10, she knew when Mrs. Bagchi was about to jib them a quarterana, and when they needed to moor the boat extra tight to battle an oncoming cyclone. She seemed to have an innate understanding of everything. What people were thinking, and sometimes what they were going to do, and what they were thinking, and how different that was to what they actually said or did. So when a family from Blacktown asked for his only possession, the boat, as dowry for her hand in marriage, he wasn't that surprised when they disappeared the next day, leaving Abba the catamaran as well as all their earthly possessions. He got himself a new mast, and Abba just went back to ferrying passengers, whispering to the wind, and making a name for herself by predicting the weather, a boon the riverine community never took for granted. The other children taunted her, but her parents ensured no one would upset the little Chotu Jor Barahanki, the little Stormbringer, because there would be hell to pay. Abba didn't notice either way. The world was her boat, the river, and her father. And then he died. Her uncle sold her floating home, and she was married into the family of a wealthy Babu with a sprawling mansion on Lattu Babu Lane. The patriarch understood some of the value she brought, and so they took her out of the water, cleaned her up, put a large red bidhi on her forehead, and tried to hide her in the zenana. But the town never let her forget that she was just a river rat. So she retreated into the labyrinth that was the Sultanate and spent her days eavesdropping on the adda of idle old men, or watching the sculptors in Kumartuli put the final coat of vermilion on a grey Durga. When her family sat for pujo, she would sneak out and spend hours with the Banyans in the Park Street Cemetery. I would perch on her shoulder, and we would spend our days grazing the feet of tombstones and collecting talismans for her black book, a large ledger given to her by her father-in-law, who never bothered to find out if she could, in fact, read or write. Instead of words, she filled the hand-woven parchment paper with herbs, leaves, and small treasures. Her favorites were a blessed red thread her father had always worn, a dried leaf from the great banyan of Howrah, remnants of what was a great Bilerat, and an old coin with the inscription of the snake and beneath it 2 arches. And so began the great grimoire of the Asirta Luana.
Okay, so could you comment on the magical elements in your...
So there were very few, right? So, but it was all magical. So, for instance, the kairos is the awakening that a child goes through or a teenager goes through at puberty when they discover they're magical. The essence of the book is, so this world has 9 graces. So the idea came from, you know how people say, grace be on you, right? May the grace of God be on you. I started trying to understand what that meant. What did the concept of grace mean? And I also wanted to understand the concept of faith, hope, and charity and why they were graces. And so I said, what if they had what if graces that were bestowed on us were very specific? So I made 8 specific graces called the Eta. And these were graces that either you were born with or you inherited or you borrowed. Borrowing is something we do all day, right? That's what we do in our rituals. Every time we do every time we do a devisam, we are borrowing. So that came from my idea of my religion, and I'm a Palgad Iyer, and so for me, ritual has been a massive part of my life. So we're always borrowing from the gods. But I said, what if we inherited or were born with graces like being able to fly or being able to, for me, weather was, and nature is a huge part of the novel, so being able to change the weather. And they came, and the concept of shaman. So for instance, so essentially that's where it came from. And the idea of the book over the 3 is essentially is the woman who has, or man, it's a very feminist novel. It's all about girls. There's no romance. Okay, it's very little romance. I was sick of young adult books focusing only on a boy and a girl and falling in love. And I think, in fact, and when we're teenagers, boys' friendship with boys and girls' friendship with girls is far more intense than girls' friendship with boys and vice versa. Yes? Your girlfriends and your boyfriends, like, you know, girls with girls and boys with boys, just friendship is very intense. It's fraught with intensity. And yes, you fall in love, but the people you really fall in love with, and might not be sexual love, is your friends. And so I wanted to explore that a lot in this book. So it's about female and male friendship as much as it is anything else, and that's where the magic really happens. So these girls go on the journey to find the one woman or man who have all the 8 graces, and therefore they're like this magical being kind of thing. Yeah.
And you're planning to extend it into a trilogy?
Yeah, it's a 3 book, obviously, because when it ends, you'll be quite annoyed with me. In that she'll find out something, and then you'll be like, okay, now what's going to happen next? I actually don't know what's going to happen next myself. But
And I think, as a person who grew up in India and read a lot of books, I think themes like sexuality or even homosexuality is hardly I hardly find it in any of our books. So, what do you think about it?
I think for instance, one of the interesting things that somebody said in the book was, um, I unknowingly, the relationship between Anya, the antagonist, and Shui, my protagonist, she's very much, she has a crush on a boy. She is, she's in a Bombay school. Um, but their relationship as it grows is very intense, has a lot of chemistry. What chemistry that is, even I can't put a finger on, because as a writer, you write and you don't know what your characters are going to do or what they're going to say most of the time. They just come alive as you write. So a lot of my friends asked me that question and like, what's going on here? I said, there's nothing really. I think that's where we need to address it. I think in that sense, we do have to, again, that's what I'm saying. I think we focus a lot on very stereotypical ideas of romance. But where there's, and I wanted to look at intensity of love everywhere, friendship primarily, sister and brother. For instance, she's very close to her older brother. But that never gets explored. The sibling relationship, we never focus on it. Whereas they focus on, how siblings have a very deep understanding of, and they're essentially that one person who's seen you all your life. So I wanted to spend some time on that. I think as time goes on, especially with 377, we are going to see a lot more, understanding of different types of love. That there isn't just one type of love. It will filter into our books. There isn't enough of it. Growing up, for instance, I knew a friend that was quite feminine. He was very sure of himself, and he was very lucky that he was part of a class that understood him very well. He was never bullied. He was so confident in his being, in his skin, and so for me, it was never odd. And for some reason, I think my school was a very good school because they never pointed it out. They never put him to the side. He just was part of us, and he was there. We were there. It was all one. It literally was. I only when I left school did I realize that something was there was another way to look at it. So I think if you get to children early enough, and I think this age of 12, 13, 14 is so formative that if you can teach them compassion and kindness, they will become compassionate and kind. If you teach them violence, I think it will change the way they think.
Now, let me ask you a tough question: J.K. Rowling or Edith Blyton?
Definitely Rolling.
Okay.
Definitely. Sorry. Even though Folk of the Faraway Tree was I think, definitely Rolling. But I think also because I haven't read Enid Blyton in a long time.
Okay. Now, could you comment on young adult fiction in India?
I think that's a tough one. So interestingly, I'm the only true young adult author to be invited to any of these festivals. I do a lot of children's festivals. And I think young adult fiction in India is very different. So I think what they try and do very well. So Duckbill is a fantastic publisher, and they're doing so much work trying to bring great themes into young adult literature, and they're using that space to educate people. I think it's very small. I think there's a lot that can be done. What I think we need to do is we need to make it fun, because we're competing with Sarah J. Maas, Veronica Roth, Percy Jackson, Geronimo Stilton. We need to make it more fun. We need to make it more relevant. What we're trying to do a lot of the time is trying and addressing issues through stories. That's great, but I think we also need to understand that if you want them to get to read more, it needs to be fun. It needs to be wonderful stories that they can get sucked into, and they can say, we want to read more. So I think it's just beginning. The publishers are doing a fantastic job. Duckbill has, I think, because of them, a lot of it is coming out. A lot of books are getting published. Uh, Children's literature is fantastic. We're going through this massive boom of where illustrators like Priya Kurian, who's here, she's a wonderful illustrator. Tulika, so I think after 13, 14, something changes and the kids don't have anything to read. So they go from, until 13, 14, they have tons of stuff till they're 12, 13. Then they immediately go look for books from outside the country. And I think that I think hopefully books like The Hidden Children will change that, and say that we do have, and maybe 13, 14, 15, 17, 18, 19-year-olds will read books and say, Indian kids are cool, Indian teenagers are cool, Indian kids have cool parents, grandparents, and not everybody is affluent. And not everybody is wearing Gucci or Louis Vuitton, and that's the other side we're trying to suddenly address, and that also is not very realistic. So I think, so yes, it's changing, and hopefully books
One
like
last
this will make a
question
difference.
before we take questions from the audience, and that is, how do you think, how significant are writing workshops in helping, budding authors?
Well, I would obviously, as a person who holds lots of writing workshops, say it's extremely critical. um, um, are you talking about budding writers or generally?
In general.
I think in general, everyone should take, if they're not writing in school, and if you don't like writing, you're in a lot of trouble because you're going to be spending the rest of your life writing. So it is writing for Instagram, writing for social media, writing for college, writing college essays. Because if you want to go to college, you've got to write college essays. If you want to do well in college, you're going to have to write. So what I think is the issue is that we're not teaching writing properly. We're not teaching people to. So writing workshops are fantastic because it teaches people how to use their imagination. I use a lot of graphic organizers, etc. So go online, learn to write. If they're not teaching you well in school, then go outside and learn to write. Read more, write more. And most important thing though, and I tell my nephew this all the time, because he reads a lot and he writes a lot, but he never finishes anything, is to finish it. Put it in and give it to someone else to read. And to be unafraid, because the fact that you've written something is in itself an achievement. So give it to somebody else to read and they get feedback and make it better. But finish it. So, yeah.
Please ask questions to ma'am now.
Ma'am, you're a good reader, I hope. Then, what was your first reading experience, or what made you inspire to read more?
Oh, to read more. I was just, I think, we were very lucky as young people, or like even middle grade. We had nothing else to do in Coimbatore. So literally my summers were spent up in a tree like this, reading with a friend of mine. And for me, of course, Folk of the Faraway Tree, The Hobbit, Tolkien, which is why I write fantasy fiction, because I think fantasy fiction is what made me happy when I was young. And growing up, I think Tolkien, Robin Hobb, even crime writers like P.D. James inspired me to write more. John Connolly today. But as a child, it would definitely be Enid Blyton and Alice in Wonderland. Oh my God, how can I forget Through the Looking Glass? Mind-blowing stuff. Yeah, that's what made me read. Grimm's fairy tales. I still remember in Kotagiri, no light, using torch, reading the Grimm's fairy tales. So fascinated, and I could just keep reading it. Yeah.
Good morning, ma'am. Thank you for giving me
My
the
pleasure.
opportunity. You all know that we young adults have this imaginative power that flourishes every time. Yesterday, I attended a session on short fiction, and they mentioned that we all have short deficit. We don't pay attention to anything anymore. So what has been the biggest challenge while writing novels for these young adults?
One, this is 400 pages, right? So can you imagine what the publisher said? Challenges, yeah. I think it's not that people. I think people are not necessarily reading less, but they just have so much more to do now, and that's the challenge. So you need to create a story that really captures their imagination, which is why which is why writing something that really makes it work helps them read more. The problem is today that everything else we do, interestingly enough, putting up a good post on Instagram takes a lot of work. Okay, I suffer, as you can tell from my feed. All of that is a lot of work. Huh? It's not easy. It takes imagination. The good Instagram social media influencers are very imaginative in the way they structure their thoughts. The way they use the photograph to build on it using their words. So it's not that we're not using our imagination. What I think is it's not working because of if you're just constantly on your phone and you're scrolling, it's not working. So either you participate actively in reading the news, doing something about the news, if that's your medium, It is what it is. I don't think we can go back in time now. So it is what it is. I think if you want to, and of course, reading obviously works your imagination because it's nothing, right? There's no visual. I mean, I do have illustrations here, and I love that I do. But it's you have to imagine everything, and that takes a little bit of work, and you have to get sucked in. So it takes time. But you know how it's so wonderful when you see someone reading your book and they've spent 3-4 hours reading it. They come outside like coming from underwater. It's a wonderful experience if you can get stuck into a book. You just have to take the time out now and switch the phone off for a couple of hours and work that. And from a writing perspective, it's very important. Obviously, if you want to be a writer, then to do graphic organizers or worksheets that we do to work that so that it's like a warm-up before you write.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
I'm Krishna Priya. I'm from Coimbatore.
Oh, you're from Coimbatore. Hi.
I study in PSGR Krishnamurti College.
Hi.
Yes, we had a syllabus. In our syllabus, we had young adult fiction as a paper. So that was one of the innovative things that happened, and we were the only lucky set. That is, after our set, they took it off. So,
why did they take it off?
They think that's not serious, or
that's the big problem that we face, yes.
So we were the only set to have young adult fiction as a serious core paper. So we studied the different characteristics, how it happens. The most common thing, like young adult fiction comes out in series most of the time.
Yes.
So all these, they show two different contradictory things. That is, either they come in series and people tend to go on reading into that world. At the same time, people don't sit and read at all. The two different extremes. So what do you think of that? How can graphic novels that is becoming popular balance this?
Graphic novels, that's what I tell parents. If your children are reading comics, please let them read the comics. So I think what graphic novels like, for instance, I don't know if any of you have read Neil Gaiman's Sandman or any Neil Gaiman. I think that's what he's tried to do, is try to bring a very literary bend to The Watchmen, for instance. They're all great books. They stand alone, fantastic works of fiction. I think to some extent graphic novels do bridge that barrier where they are shorter, faster, and don't require you to spend as much time in a room reading. On the series front, the reason young adult novels are written in series is we like exploring big epic arcs and stories that need to be told over a period of time. We could put all of them in one big book and it would be like War and Peace and nobody, anyway, people, this is fat enough. Can you imagine people reading something this thick? 2, it takes a writer time to write it, and of course from a publishing perspective, it's fun. Like I read this and now everyone's going to buy the next one because they want to know what happens next. So it's a bit of everything. It's commercialism. It's a little bit of everything. So the not reading at all comes from, I think, kids who read have parents who read. If you want your kids to read, you have to read in front of them. If you're the first thing you're going to do in the morning is put on the TV instead of read the newspaper, your child will also go put on the TV and watch something instead of go and reading the newspaper. If you're doing the same thing in the evening, that's what they're going to do. It's that simple as that. So if the child hasn't grown up reading, which a lot of children don't because their parents don't read, why would you do something different to what the most important people in your life are doing? Not, you won't. You're not going to. It doesn't make any, it isn't rational. So you're not going to read. Then to pick up reading is very hard because it's a trained mind that reads a book. It's training. You have to train yourself to sit and read over a period of an hour, get sucked in. And if you're not trained to do that, it's very difficult to do it. So yeah, I hope that helps. Anyone else?
So,
Yeah, of course.
Hello, Reshma. It was nice listening to you. Actually, I am a teacher,
Okay.
teaching English literature to poor agrarian students who read only guides, not even texts. Okay. So, how can we help them to read English? That's
How
my
can we
question.
help them to read?
Yeah, basically, they don't read anything. So, do you have any suggestions?
I think one is to one is to tie in a visual component. I think, for instance, create a soundtrack to the book, create visual elements that can work with the books. So, for instance, if you're reading Wuthering Heights, take them to a castle. So, I see my toddler today. She's reading, princess stories. She's reading monster stories. Everywhere she sees, she's trying to link it back to a book. Amachi's Glasses. I don't know if you're all too old to read Amachi's Glasses, but Amachi's Glasses written by Priya Kurian or drawn, illustrated by Priya Kurian. Everywhere she sees a tree, she's talking about banyans now at 3. So I think link that from one to the other and read books that are relevant to them. If you are going to read an English book that is talking about something 6,000 miles away, it isn't going to make sense to them. That's so sad. Bring books that work. So for older students, read Perumal Murugan. I think that we are not doing that enough. For instance, I remember somebody told me that Perumal Murugan is not taught in our universities. I don't understand that. How can you not teach Perumal Murugan? K.R. Meera. So what happens then is there's something that they read in English that's completely relevant to them. Their lives, they're represented, and contextualizes everything, and they get stuck into the story. And of course, read this. I have to plug it. Yes, you have a question.
Okay. As someone who exclusively gravitates towards young adult fiction, thanks for bringing out an Indian work. But the thing is, when we talk about fantasy in India, we always, and you mentioned this, we always go towards mythology. It's all based on Karna or Krishna or whoever.
Yeah.
So how, was there like an anxiety that you would have to, like, did you purposefully steer away from that? Did you feel like you had to?
One, I don't read mythology. I mean, I love mythology. One, you can't help but love mythology. You've grown up with mythology. So to the point where I think mythology has become our fact and it is not our fiction, which is why children get tired of it, right? And two, our mythology is very narrative in that it is very tell, not show. So Krishna said this, Shiva did that. We're not going into it, which is why Amish did so well, because he brought in a level of storytelling to that. I tried. It wasn't a very hard thing for me to do because I knew that wasn't what interested me. I wanted to build my own mythology, my own world, my own words, my own language. I have a glossary at the back of the book. I wanted to explore. That doesn't mean it doesn't have Indian roots. It's not necessarily it's not a Western inspired, but it does have Western tropes because that's what I grew up with. I'm trying to bring those tropes and put it in an Indian context, because we do have witches, we do have magic that is outside mythology. We have tantrism, we have a lot of black magic, we have a lot of ritual that has nothing to do with mythology. I wanted to explain, and our pantheon in terms of our pagan culture is so strong, and I love pagan cultures, and I love our how deeply enrooted we are with trees and nature. There's nowhere like our country. Our reverence for snakes, and all of that is something I wanted. That's what I found magical, and I wanted to touch upon. So yes, there's no mythology in it at all, but it wasn't hard for me at all. No, not at all.